So here we are, a few days after the summer solstice, and from like 50 meters away now I can smell the linden or lime tree in full bloom. You can see the flowers have this, they're directly attached to what at least looks like a leaf. And then there are these other leaves, which are probably called the true leaves. And when they're younger, these are edible. And so, I mean, it's a beautiful tree. It can live for several centuries. And it has a very fine-grained wood, which makes it very good for sculpting and especially sculpting. But yeah, so medicinally speaking, the lime flowers are used, and they have a very pleasant taste, and that's definitely a big advantage they have. And so I mean, as a tea, just with a pleasant honey-like taste, they make a pretty relaxing drink. But otherwise, the official indications, or rather the official actions, would be being antispasmodic, a nervine, a diaphoretic, and a hypotensive. So this makes it very good in hypertension, and especially hypertension that's related to a nervous component, as opposed to necessarily an atherosclerotic or an organic component. But there's something else that I find very interesting about the linden in general. So the Latin name being the Tilia species. But it's an effect that I've noticed particularly on this specific tree. And so here, for example, you see a bee, and it's completely still. It doesn't move. And so during the summers here, when the linden is in flower, it's just buzzing with bees. You can hear them all over the place. And so I don't come collect the linden in the afternoon, because I let the bees do their thing, and I mean, if I don't bother them, they don't come bother me. But yeah, so during the summer, sometimes on the floor, like really, basically in the shadow of the tree, all on the floor, it'll just be peppered with bees that are just laying, at least seemingly dead. I mean, very still at least. And so at first I thought there was a big problem, because these bees all look dead, and I mean, it seemed pretty clear there was at least a correlation to this tree. Here's another bee. See, it's really just kind of grasping on the branch here. It's not even pollinating, going for the pollen or anything. But yeah, so the bees would be all over the floor, but then generally after a few days they'd all be gone. So I mean, it's possible that they were just swept away by the wind, but I think it's more likely that they were actually not dead but just stupefied, and then they got up and just kind of just went away. So it's actually still kind of busy here, and it's interesting to note that these bees, which are much more active, these are not the types of bees I tend to see paralyzed onto the branch. It's really these other kind of fatter bees that we see here. So here's another active one. So I was actually almost afraid to use the flowers from this tree, thinking that maybe they were toxic, but then I figured it might have to do with the fact that the linden tree is used for its sedative properties. So it's a calming plant. But I have heard that when the flowers are too ripe, too mature, that they become borderline narcotic. And I've personally never experienced this, but I've definitely experienced the sedating effect of the linden. So I figured the bees were pretty much just kind of super stoned, and yeah, I just kind of laughed about it. But so very recently actually looked into it. And it turns out that actually it's not as funny as that. But it turns out that there's actually different species of Tilia. And I do not know which species this is. Species of Tilia. I don't know which species it is. But it turns out that certain species contain very high levels of a sugar called mannose. And this sugar is particularly high on very dry summers, and we've been having a lot of those recently in Belgium. And actually today is the first time it's rained well, at least since I've been here, so at least for 2 weeks, but I've heard longer than that. Here's another sleeper bee. But yeah, so these Tilias on very hot summers, they produce a sugar called mannose. And apparently, this gets converted into mannose 6-phosphate, if I remember correctly. And normally, at least in humans, this mannose 6-phosphate then gets converted into fructose 6-phosphate. But the bees don't have the enzyme to transform mannose 6-phosphate into fructose 6-phosphate, and the former is toxic to them. So in reality, the bees can truly die from this sugar, or at least have been noted to become paralyzed from it. So I find this interesting on an ecological level because, I mean, first of all, this is definitely one of the most melliferous, if you can say this in English, meaning it attracts bees. It's one of the most melliferous trees I know of. And so I find it strange that the bees would continue to come back to it when, I mean, they're literally killing themselves. So, I mean, either they get a huge amount of pleasure and they do it just like we intoxicate ourselves to death, or, I mean, or there's another idea that this species of linden is just not native to the region. And so the bees, but it's similar enough to confuse the bees to come to it. But so anyways, so it's also interesting for the human from a therapeutic point of view, because I often see in herbal medicine texts, when they talk about lime, they just talk about Tilia species. They don't make any differentiation between different species, although some texts I've read do specify the platyphyllos species. But so it seems like there is, though, a remarkable difference between different Tilia species, and so I would think that there's probably different actions and indications for the Tilia species. So, for example, if this species does indeed produce a lot of mannose sugar, well, I've read further into the uses of mannose, and I think it's used as a cutting agent for cocaine, but more relevant, it apparently is very promising in the long-term management of recurrent cystitis. And so there's some interesting research done on that. So I've never seen Tilia suggested for the management of cystitis, but in these cases it might be interesting to look into it. And then similarly, I'm a bit curious now as to the differences between these two species of bees, and which ones produce honey, and if both of them are native to the region and all this. But yeah, so I'm gonna be harvesting some of this linden. It makes a very good infusion. It can make a decent liquor, but particularly pleasant, I have found, is to gather a bunch of it and set up a hot bath and put the flower in it, and then put myself in it, like in a giant teacup, and it smells really nice, and on top of this, kinda, sedates you a bit and makes you super ready for bed. So yeah, so I'm gonna get harvesting now. Just a little side note here, as I'm picking the lime, I find this plant here, which, as you can see, is very different, and is not lime, even though it directly comes out of the branch of a lime tree, and a branch that is rotting. And so this is actually mistletoe, or Viscum album. And this is a very intriguing plant. It's a plant that I've never tried or used in, or seen anybody use in herbal medicine, but it was one of the plants, the most respected plants of the Druids, and said to hold a bunch of magical properties. But then it does, of course, have also medicinal properties that are empirically validated, primarily as a hypotensive, but a powerful one, much more powerful than Tilia. But also as a anti-cancer agent is being investigated. But so what's interesting about the mistletoe, though, is that it's a parasitic plant, in that it doesn't have roots, but it derives its nutrients from the host tree it finds itself on, and it can be found on Tilia, on ash, on beech, or really on a series of trees, and a notable one is on oak trees, and this was said to have particularly powerful properties. But interestingly enough, you really never find it on, or it's extremely rare to find it on oak trees nowadays, and I've never seen it growing on oak trees. But so, why is it more highly regarded when it grows on oak trees than on linden or whatever? Well, it's because as a parasitic plant, it takes its nutrients from the trees, and so this actually influences the mistletoe itself's composition. And apparently there's a particular, I don't want to call it a synergy because supposedly the mistletoe is parasitic, but the mistletoe's properties are, I guess, enhanced by whatever it takes from the oak tree. So if anybody sees an oak tree with mistletoe growing in it, know that it is highly regarded, and I've heard that there are researchers, particularly in Switzerland, pharmaceutical researchers, who will pay very good sums of money for the mistletoe that grows from oak, presumably to work on very lucrative cancer drugs.